Donald Trump leaned back in his chair, staring at the tiny gun in his hands. It was small, barely bigger than his palm, but something about it sent a chill down his spine. He had found it buried deep in the cellar, hidden behind a stack of old campaign posters. No dust, no rust like someone had put it there recently. Charlotte, his girlfriend, peeked in from the kitchen. "Donald, you've been down there forever. What are you doing?" He hesitated. "Nothing. Just cleaning." She gave him a curious look, but didn't push. Instead, she went back to making dinner, humming a tune as if everything were normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. That night, as a snowstorm raged outside, Donald lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed old memories, campaign speeches, rallies, negotiations, but there was something missing. Gaps in his past that he had never questioned before. Until now, determined to find answers, he booked a flight to Oxford, the town where he had grown up but barely remembered. Something in his gut told him the tiny gun was connected to his past, and he wasn't leaving without the truth. When he arrived, Oxford was just as he remembered: quaint, cold, and oddly quiet. But as he walked through the streets, people gave him strange looks, not out of recognition, but like they knew something he didn't. Then he met Robert Parker, a journalist, sharp-eyed and dangerously charming. Robert had a way of asking questions that made people spill their secrets before they even realized it. Over coffee, Robert leaned in. "Trump, do you know why you're really here?" Donald frowned. "I'm looking for answers." Robert smirked. "Then let me give you one. Your past isn't what you think it is." Donald felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" Robert took out his phone, scrolled for a moment, then turned the screen toward him. Donald's breath caught. It was an old newspaper article. The headline read, "Mysterious disappearance in Oxford, local boy vanishes without a trace." And beneath it was a photo of a young boy, a boy who looked exactly like him. Donald stared at the screen, his heart pounding. The face staring back at him was undeniably his, but younger, so much younger. The article was dated 20 years ago, yet the boy in the photo was the spitting image of him as a child. "What is this?" Donald's voice was low, almost a whisper. Robert Parker leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Donald's. "That's the mystery of your past, Mr. Trump. There's a gap in your history, a piece that doesn't fit." Donald's mind raced. The image of that boy haunted him. Had he vanished? Was this the gap he had been feeling all along? Robert continued, scrolling through his phone. "I've been investigating this for a while. You were reported missing for days, Donald. People said you just disappeared." Donald shook his head. "That doesn't make sense. I grew up in this town. I never—" Robert cut him off. "But your memories don't add up, do they?" He was now speaking with a quiet urgency. "Everyone remembers you being in Oxford, but there's no record of what happened during those days. It's like they were erased, and you were never supposed to remember." Donald clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "So what? I was kidnapped? My whole life's a lie?" Robert looked at him, his face serious. "That's just the beginning. There's more to this, more than just a missing boy." Donald felt his head spinning. His entire life had always been so controlled. His career, his family, his persona, they were all so carefully constructed. Could everything have been built on a foundation of lies? Robert stood up. "There's one person who can answer all of this, but they won't come easily." "Who?" Donald asked, his voice sharp. "A woman named Charlotte Doop." Donald froze. "My girlfriend?" Robert nodded. "She's more than just your girlfriend. Much more. She's part of this mess." Donald's heart skipped a beat. Charlotte? The woman who had stood by his side for so long? Could she really be involved in all of this? He stood up, his mind racing. "No, she's not involved in this. She couldn't be." Robert's gaze softened. "I'm not saying she's guilty, but I am saying she knows things about you about your true past that you're not ready to hear. A cold chill ran down Donald's spine. Find her, Robert said, his tone now colder, and the truth will finally come out. Donald nodded, a feeling of determination settling in. He wasn't leaving Oxford until he got the answers he needed, but he had no idea what he was about to uncover. The snowstorm outside had turned Oxford into a ghost town. Streets were empty, houses darkened, and the only sound was the soft, rhythmic beat of Donald's footsteps on the snow-covered ground. Robert's words echoed in his mind. Charlotte knew something, but what? And why would she keep it from him? He dialed her number, his finger trembling slightly on the screen. It rang once, twice, before she picked up. Donald? Her voice was soft, but steady. What's wrong? I need to see you. Now. There was a pause on the other end. Then, quietly, she said, Where are you? I'm at the old bookstore. The one on Maple Street. Charlotte didn't ask questions. I'll be there soon. Donald hung up and ran a hand through his hair, nerves gnawing at his insides. This wasn't just about uncovering his past anymore. It was about confronting everything he had believed in, everything he had trusted. The bookstore looked just like it always had, a small, cozy shop nestled between two old buildings. The wooden sign hanging above the door read the written word. Donald stepped inside, the doorbell ringing as he entered. The warmth of the store hit him instantly, but the comfort of the familiar setting did little to calm his racing thoughts. He walked to the back, where a small seating area was set up by a crackling fire. It was there he saw her, Charlotte. She was sitting in one of the worn leather chairs, her face illuminated by the glow of the fire. As soon as Donald stepped into the room, she stood up, her eyes filled with concern. You're here, she said softly. I was getting worried. Donald didn't waste time. You know, don't you? Charlotte's face shifted just for a moment. There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, maybe? Regret? She took a deep breath. I know a lot of things, Donald, but I didn't want you to know. He stepped forward. You've been hiding something from me. Something about my past. About who I really am. Her eyes softened, but she didn't speak right away. Instead, she gestured for him to sit. This is going to be difficult to understand, but I think it's time you knew. Donald sat, waiting for her to continue. I didn't know you back then, Donald. Not the way I do now. You weren't always the man you are today. She paused, searching his face for any sign of understanding. You weren't supposed to be. Your family, they made you. You were part of something bigger, something dangerous. They erased your past so you could play the role they wanted. Donald shook his head, disbelief washing over him. What are you talking about? My past is my past. I came from nothing. I worked for everything I have. Charlotte's eyes met his, and in them was a quiet sadness. That's what they wanted you to believe. You were groomed, Donald. Your life, your career, it was all set up from the beginning. And she hesitated. I've been part of it all. His breath caught in his throat. You? Charlotte nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I was never just your girlfriend. I was sent to keep you on track, to make sure you didn't remember who you really were. They made sure you wouldn't find out the truth. Donald stood up, his head spinning. This whole time, you've been lying to me? No, she pleaded. It's not like that. I didn't want to hurt you, but I knew this day would come. The day when you would start asking questions. And now she trailed off. Now it's too late. They're coming for you. Donald froze. Who's coming? Charlotte's voice was trembling. The people who created you. They won't stop until you're back in their control. He swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. His entire life, everything he had known, had been manipulated, and the people behind it were closing in. Before he could say anything, the door to the bookstore creaked open, and a familiar voice called out, Mr. Trump. Donald turned around, his heart sinking. Standing in the doorway was none other than Robert Parker, but his expression was cold, calculating, nothing like the man who had helped him so far. "I'm afraid the truth has already been decided for you." Robert's voice was smooth, his eyes narrowing. "And you won't be leaving Oxford with your memories intact." Charlotte's face paled. "They found us. Get out of here," Donald said, his voice steady. He wasn't going to let anyone control him any longer. He wasn't going down without a fight. But as he moved toward Robert, a sudden flash of light from outside caught his attention. The storm outside was no longer just snow, it was a blizzard of shadows swirling in the wind, closing in. And in that moment, Donald realized his fight wasn't just for answers, it was for his very soul. The wind howled outside the bookstore, a strange mix of snow and shadow swirling in the streets. Donald's heart was pounding as he stared at Robert, who stood in the doorway, his face hardening into something almost unrecognizable. "This is it, Mr. Trump," Robert said, his voice steady but cold. "You can't run from the truth anymore. It's been decided for you." Donald clenched his fists. "I don't care what you think you know. I'm done being controlled. You can't take away what I've built." But Robert just smiled. That same twisted, knowing smile that "You've already lost, Donald. They've already taken everything. You're part of something far bigger than you've ever imagined." Charlotte stepped forward, shaking her head. "He's right, Donald. It's too late. They'll make sure you stay in line, one way or another. There's no escaping them." Donald turned to her, his face filled with anger and confusion. "You're not just part of this, Charlotte. You've been the one pulling the strings from the start. You lied to me. You used me." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. "I never wanted this. But I couldn't fight them. They have too much power." Donald's mind was spinning. Everything he thought he knew, everything he had believed about himself, it was all a lie. He had been created, manipulated, and controlled by people who wanted to use him as a pawn in their game. And now they were here to collect. Suddenly, Robert stepped forward, his hand extending toward Donald. "Give up, Trump. You don't even know who you are anymore." Donald stepped back, his heart racing. He could feel the cold shadows closing in around him, the weight of his own confusion threatening to crush him. But then something in him snapped. "And oh," he said, his voice firm, "I will remember. I will fight. I will never let you control me again." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the tiny gun he had found earlier. It felt heavy in his hand, but somehow it was comforting, a symbol of his resistance. Robert's eyes widened, but he didn't move. "You think that gun will save you?" Donald didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Charlotte. "I need you to leave now." She hesitated, tears streaming down her face. "Donald, please. You don't understand." "I understand enough," he interrupted. "You were never my ally. Not really. You were just part of the system." Charlotte's face twisted in pain, and she turned away, walking toward the door. As she opened it, she paused, glancing back at him one last time. "I'm sorry," she whispered before disappearing into the storm. Donald turned back to Robert, his eyes burning with defiance. "Now it's just you and me." But Robert wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was cold, calculating. "You don't know what you're up against." Donald took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the gun. "I know exactly what I'm up against. It's you." In an instant, the room seemed to freeze. The storm outside intensified, and shadows seemed to rise from the floor, swirling around Robert and Donald. The air was thick with tension. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a voice deep, distant, and echoing spoke from the shadows. "It's time, Mr. Trump. You are ours." The shadows closed in faster than Donald could react. The tiny gun in his hand felt insignificant against the overwhelming force closing in on him. But in that moment, he realized one thing. He had been chosen. Chosen to fight. Chosen to resist. and he wasn't about to go down without a fight. With one last surge of defiance, Donald raised the gun and pointed it toward the shadows. But as he did, everything around him seemed to blur. The storm outside, the shadows in the room, even Robert's cold stare, they all seemed to disappear. And just like that, the world went dark. When Donald opened his eyes again, he was standing in a different, unfamiliar, empty room. There was no storm, no Robert, no Charlotte, only silence. The gun had vanished, and he was alone. The legend of Donald Trump had become a part of Oxford's dark history. His true identity, his true purpose, would remain a mystery for generations to come. But in the end, Donald Trump had won, not through power, not through manipulation, but through his refusal to be controlled even when he had no idea who he truly was. The end, or is it? Join us for this thrilling and twisted adventure that explores identity, power, and control in a world where nothing is as it seems. Donald Trump, Charlotte Doop, Robert Parker, who can you trust? Watch the full story unfold in this epic mystery. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more mind-bending stories and thrilling plot twists.